If telling the truth meant turning your whole town against you, would you still uncover the old printing press? The courthouse bell had barely finished its 9 o'clock song when Martha Kellerman pulled the heavy wool covering from her printing press. Dust motes danced in the sudden shaft of sunlight that poured through the newspaper office windows, the first natural light the press had seen in 3 months. She ran her fingers along the iron frame, feeling the cold metal warm beneath her touch. Time to let you breathe again, old friend. The press had been her father's pride before consumption took him last winter. Now it sat silent in the cramped office above Millbrook's main street, while she kept house for her brother Samuel and taught piano lessons to supplement the family income. The Millbrook Herald had died with Papa, or so everyone assumed. Martha lifted the leather satchel from the desk, her first prop, worn smooth by her father's hands, and now holding his final editorial notes. Inside, yellowed papers spoke of justice delayed and truth buried. She pulled out the top sheet, his spidery handwriting still legible. A newspaper's duty is to shine light where others prefer shadow. The floorboards creaked as she walked to the window. Down on Main Street, Sheriff Rawlings emerged from the bank, his heavy steps measured and deliberate. $47, she'd heard him mention the amount to the banker. That was exactly what the Chinese families owed in back taxes, the sum that would determine whether they kept their small gardens behind the railroad depot or lost everything to the town council's new beautification ordinance. A knock rattled the office door. Martha quickly covered the press again, smoothing the wool blanket flat. "Martha? You up there?" Samuel's voice carried up the narrow stairway. "Just dusting, Samuel." He appeared in the doorway, his store apron still dusted with flour from the morning's deliveries. "Mrs. Hancock sent word. She's cancelling Emily's piano lessons for the month. Says the girl needs to focus on more suitable accomplishments." Martha's hands stilled on the blanket. Another $2 gone from their monthly income. "Did she say why?" Samuel's jaw tightened. "She heard you were seen talking to that Chinese woman at the depot yesterday. Mrs. Chen was asking about her son's schooling. I merely—" "Martha." Samuel stepped fully into the room, his voice dropping low. "You can't be seen consorting with them. Not now. The town council meets Friday to vote on the ordinance. If we want to keep our standing—" "Our standing?" The words came sharper than she'd intended. Papa never cared about standing when there was truth to be told. Papa's dead. Samuel's words hit like a physical blow. And we're still here. Still need to eat. Still need this roof over our heads. The store provides for us both, but only if folks trust us to serve their kind. Their kind. Martha's fingers found the edge of her father's satchel. "And what kind are we, Samuel?" He stared at her for a long moment, then turned away. "The surviving kind. Keep that press covered, Martha. Please." His footsteps faded down the stairs. Martha waited until she heard the shop bell jingle below, then walked back to the window. The sun had climbed higher now, casting sharp shadows across the street. At the depot, smoke from the morning train still hung in the air like a question mark against the blue Colorado sky. She opened the satchel again and pulled out the second sheet of her father's notes. This one bore a single line. "Truth has no proper time. It's simply island." Outside, the courthouse bell struck 9:30, and Martha Kellerman made a choice that would change everything. She pulled the wool covering from the press and folded it into a neat square, placing it in the corner where it could no longer hide what needed to see the light. The press stood ready, waiting for her touch, as golden sunlight streamed across its surface like a promise finally ready to be kept. By 10 o'clock, Martha had the press cleaned and oiled, its mechanical parts moving smoothly for the first time in months. The leather satchel lay open on her father's desk, his notes spread before her like a map to forbidden territory. She found the story he'd been working on before his death. 3 pages of careful documentation about the Chinese families who'd built the railroad spur into Millbrook. Their contract promised land grants, fair wages, and permanent settlement rights. But somewhere between the rails being laid and the depot being built, those promises had vanished like morning mist. The office door opened without a knock. Martha spun around to find Timothy Chen standing in the doorway, his school satchel clutched against his chest. "Miss Kellerman, I brought something for you." The boy was perhaps 12, with intelligent eyes and clothes that had been carefully mended. His English carried the precision of someone who'd learned it as a second language, each word chosen with care. Timothy, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in school? School dismissed early. Mrs. Peterson says the stove needs repair. He stepped into the room, his gaze moving to the uncovered printing press. My mother asked me to give you this. From his satchel, he produced a folded piece of rice paper, her second prop, thin as butterfly wings but weighted with importance. Martha accepted it carefully, noting the Chinese characters written in delicate brushstrokes alongside English words in a woman's careful hand. She wrote it for the newspaper, Timothy said, before she heard the newspaper was sleeping. Martha unfolded the paper. The English portion read, "We came to build the railroad that feeds your town. We stayed to grow food in ground others called worthless. We ask only for the rights promised to all who make America their home." Tell me about your mother's garden, Martha said. Timothy's face brightened. She grows vegetables the townspeople never seen before. Bok choy, snow peas, Chinese cabbage. Last summer, when the regular crops failed from the drought, she shared with everyone. Even gave seeds to Mrs. Murphy when her husband was out of work. Martha walked to the window. Down on Main Street, Sheriff Rawlings was talking with 3 members of the town council. Even from this distance, she could read the tension in their postures. Timothy, what happens if your families lose the garden plots? We go somewhere else, I suppose. Papa says there are other towns, other railroads that need building. The boy's voice remained steady, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his satchel. But this is home now. The only home I remember. The courthouse bell began striking 10:30, each note hanging in the air like a decision demanding to be made. Martha folded the rice paper carefully and placed it in her father's satchel alongside his notes. Timothy, tell your mother her letter will be in tomorrow's newspaper. The boy's eyes widened. The Herald is sleeping. Not anymore. Martha moved to the printing press, her hands finding the familiar controls. It's time for it to wake up. Timothy smiled, the first genuine joy she'd seen from him. Mother will be so happy. She says American newspapers are like the village drums back in China. When they speak, everyone listens. After he left, Martha stood before the press as the sun climbed toward noon. Her father's words echoed in her memory. A newspaper's duty is to shine light where others prefer shadow. Outside, the shadows were growing shorter, and the truth was getting harder to hide. She began setting type for the first edition of the Millbrook Herald to run in 3 months. The headline would read, "The Garden Question, Rights and Promises in Millbrook." Below it, Mrs. Chen's letter would appear in full, followed by her father's research on the original railroad contracts. As the type fell into place with satisfying clicks, Martha realized she was no longer just keeping her father's promise. She was making one of her own to Timothy, to Mrs. Chen, and to a version of Millbrook that might exist if enough people chose to step out of the shadows and into the light. The courthouse bell struck 11, and the press rolled forward with its first clean impression in months, black ink spreading across white paper like truth, finally finding its voice. Martha worked through the lunch hour, her fingers black with ink, her back aching from bending over the type cases. The courthouse bell struck 1 o'clock, as she pulled the first proof sheet from the press. Her father's words stared back at her in fresh black type, accompanied by Mrs. Chen's letter and a careful reproduction of the original railroad contract she'd found in the county records. The office door opened again. This time it was Adelaide Hancock, her silk dress rustling as she climbed the narrow stairs. The older woman's face carried the determined expression Martha remembered from church social committees and town improvement meetings. "Martha, dear, I've come to discuss Emily's piano lessons. Samuel mentioned you were cancelling them." Mrs. Hancock's gaze swept the office, taking in the uncovered press, the scattered type, the proof sheet lying flat on the ink-stained table. Her nostrils flared slightly at the smell of printer's ink and machine oil. "I see you've been tidying up your father's things." "I've been doing his work." Martha wiped her hands on a rag, leaving black smears on the white cloth. The work he died trying to finish. "Martha." Mrs. Hancock's voice carried the patient tone she'd use with a child. "Your father was a good man, but he had ideas that weren't practical for a town like ours. We've built something stable here, something peaceful. Why disturb that? Martha lifted the proof sheet, holding it between them like a barrier. 47 families came to build our railroad. Now, 3 families remain. Working land, the railroad company granted them. The town council wants to seize that land because their vegetables look different than ours. It's not about vegetables, dear. It's about fitting in, contributing to the community in ways that benefit everyone, like sharing seeds when the drought hit, like Mrs. Chen caring for the Morrison baby when he took fever. Martha set the proof sheet down carefully. Or do you mean contributing in ways that look like us? Mrs. Hancock's mouth tightened. You're putting words in my mouth. I'm putting facts in the newspaper. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Outside, a freight wagon rumbled past, its wheels raising dust that caught the afternoon light. Mrs. Hancock walked to the window and stood with her back to Martha, her reflection wavering in the glass. I came here to help you, Martha, to offer you something better than this. She turned around, her face softer now. My cousin in Denver runs a finishing school for young ladies. She could use someone with your education, your musical abilities. You could have a real life there, away from all this complexity. Martha looked around the office at her father's desk, at the press that had been silent for 3 months, at the proof sheet still damp with ink. A real life, away from the complications of truth-telling and community responsibility. What about Samuel, the store? Samuel's a grown man. He can hire help if he needs it. Mrs. Hancock stepped closer. Martha, you're young. You could marry well in Denver, have children, a proper home. Here, you'll always be Edward Kellerman's daughter, fighting battles that can't be won. The courthouse bell struck 1:15. In 15 minutes, the children would be walking home from school, including Timothy Chen with his careful English and his mother's hopes folded in his school satchel. Martha picked up Mrs. Chen's letter, the rice paper translucent in the afternoon light. She thought of the woman who'd written it, who'd learned English well enough to plead her case, who'd shared her seeds with neighbors who now wanted to drive her away. Mrs. Hancock, what kind of life is it if you have to leave home to live it? The older woman's face hardened. One that doesn't end in scandal and financial ruin. Maybe. Or maybe it's one that never begins at all. Martha walked to the press and ran her hand along its iron frame. Her father had touched this metal thousands of times, had stood in this exact spot making the same choice she faced now. The press had been silent for 3 months, but it wasn't broken. It was just waiting. Emily can resume her piano lessons next week, Martha said quietly. I'll be here every Tuesday and Thursday, same as always. But on Wednesdays, the Herald prints. Mrs. Hancock gathered her skirts, her face flushed with anger. You're making a terrible mistake, Martha. This town has a long memory. Then it's time to remember some different stories. After Mrs. Hancock left, Martha stood alone in the office as the sun slanted lower through the windows. She placed Mrs. Chen's letter in the leather satchel alongside her father's notes, then added the county records she'd copied. 3 props now. 3 pieces of truth that would either build something new or destroy what little she had left. Outside, the shadows were growing longer. But inside the newspaper office, golden light still poured across the printing press, like a promise she was finally ready to keep. Wednesday morning arrived with a storm brewing over the mountains. Martha reached the office before sunrise, the streets still empty, except for old Pete sweeping in front of the barber shop. The courthouse bell struck 6 as she lit the oil lamps and began the final preparations for the Herald's first edition. She'd worked until near midnight Tuesday, setting every line by hand, checking each word against her father's careful notes. The front page carried Mrs. Chen's letter alongside the original railroad contracts. Page 2 detailed the town ordinances passed in the Chinese family's absence, and page 3 reprinted testimonials from neighbors who'd benefited from the Chen family garden. The leather satchel sat open on the desk, now holding not just her father's notes, but also the rice, paper letter, and a third item, a copy of the property deed for the depot land, signed by the railroad president himself and bearing an official seal. Mrs. Chen had entrusted it to Timothy yesterday evening, along with a message. Tell the newspaper lady, this is our proof. Martha lifted the deed, studying the legal language that promised the Chinese workers permanent rights to the land they'd worked. The paper was yellowed but legitimate, signed and witnessed according to territorial law. It made the town council's beautification ordinance not just unfair, but illegal. Thunder rumbled overhead as she began the press run. 50 copies enough for every business on Main Street, every member of the town council, and a dozen to spare. The mechanical rhythm of the press matched her heartbeat as black ink transferred to white paper, truth taking physical form. By 8 o'clock, the first bundle was ready. Martha stepped into the grey morning light just as the courthouse bell struck the hour. Main Street was waking up storekeepers sweeping their walks, early customers heading to the mercantile, children hurrying to school before the rain began. She started with Jensen's dry goods, slipping a copy under the door. Then Murphy's boots and leather, the barber shop and the pharmacy. At each stop, she felt eyes watching from windows, faces appearing and disappearing behind glass. The mercantile door stood open. Samuel looked up from his ledger as she entered, his face already tight with worry. "Martha, what are you doing?" She placed a copy of the Herald on the counter between them. Samuel's eyes scanned the headline, and his face went pale. "You didn't." "I did." She straightened her shoulders. "Papa's work deserved to be finished. This will ruin us." Samuel's voice was barely a whisper. "Do you understand what you've done? The town council, Sheriff Rawlings, they'll never forgive this. Then they'll have to learn to live with the truth." The bell above the door jangled, and Mrs. Morrison entered with her weekly shopping list. She nodded to Samuel, glanced at Martha, then noticed the newspaper on the counter. Her eyes widened as she read the headline. "Well, I never," she murmured. "Is this really the old Herald?" "It is," Martha said. Mrs. Morrison picked up the paper, reading quickly. "Says here the Chinese folks have legal rights to that land." Legal rights signed by the railroad itself. She looked up at Martha. "Is this true?" "Every word. The documents are on file at the county courthouse." Mrs. Morrison folded the paper carefully. "My husband will want to see this. He's been wondering why the town council was in such a hurry with that ordinance vote." After she left, Samuel slumped against the counter. "Martha, you don't understand what forces you're dealing with. The town council, the business interests, they've got plans for this place that don't include Chinese gardens." "What plans?" Samuel glanced toward the window, then leaned closer. "Railroad's talking about building a bigger depot, bringing in more businesses, maybe even a hotel. That land behind the depot, it's prime real estate if you clear out the vegetable plots. So this was never about beautification. It's about money. It's always about money." Samuel's hands shook as he straightened his apron. "And now you've put us on the wrong side of it." Thunder crashed overhead, and the first fat raindrops began splattering against the windows. Martha gathered the remaining newspapers, tucking them under her shawl. Maybe there's no right side when the choice is between money and justice. She pushed back into the stormy morning, delivering papers to the remaining businesses. At the sheriff's office, she slid a copy under the door and heard voices inside discussing the Chinese problem. At the bank, the manager was already reading a copy, his brow furrowed with what looked like concern rather than anger. The courthouse bell struck 9 as Martha reached the depot. Through the rain, she could see the Chinese families working in their garden plots, trying to harvest what they could before the storm destroyed everything. Mrs. Chen looked up from her bok choy and waved, her face bright with hope. Timothy ran up to Martha, his school satchel held over his head as an improvised umbrella. "Miss Kellerman, did the newspaper really print Mother's letter?" Martha handed him a copy of the Herald. "Front page, just like I promised." The boy's face lit up as he saw his mother's words in print. He ran back to show her, both of them standing in the rain, reading together and pointing at the page. As Martha walked back toward Main Street, she noticed Sheriff Rawlings standing under the mercantile awning, a copy of the newspaper in his hands. Their eyes met across the muddy street, and she saw something unexpected in his expression, not anger, but what looked like respect. The courthouse bell struck 9:15, and Martha Kellerman realized there was no going back now. The truth was out, printed and distributed, and the whole town would have to decide what to do with it. The storm was just beginning. Friday morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having washed the air clean. The town council meeting was set for 10 o'clock, and by 9:30, Main Street buzzed with more activity than Martha had ever seen. Folks had come in from the surrounding farms, drawn by word of the newspaper story that had set the whole county talking. Martha arrived at the courthouse early, the leather satchel containing her father's work clutched tight in her hands. Inside, she found the meeting room fuller than it had been for any vote in memory. The Chinese families sat together near the front, Mrs. Chen in her best dress, Timothy beside her with his school satchel, Mr. Chen and the two other remaining families who worked the depot gardens. Sheriff Rawlings stood at the back of the room, his badge catching the morning light that streamed through the tall windows. When he saw Martha, he nodded a gesture that surprised her with its gravity. Adelaide Hancock sat with the other town council wives, her face set in disapproving lines. But scattered throughout the room were other faces Martha recognized. Mrs. Morrison, who'd bought seeds from the Chen garden last summer. The bank manager, who'd been studying the legal documents all week. Old Pete from the barber shop, even some of the railroad workers who'd stayed in Millbrook after the depot construction finished. The courthouse bell struck 10, and Mayor Brewster called the meeting to order. He was a thick-set man who owned the largest saloon in town and had never shown much interest in Chinese rights before this week. "We're here to vote on Ordinance 47, Brewster announced, the beautification measure for the depot area. But first, it seems we have some new information to consider. He held up a copy of the Herald, and murmurs rippled through the crowd. "Miss Kellerman, I understand this newspaper of yours has raised some questions about the legal status of the depot land." Martha stood, her heart hammering. "It has, Mayor Brewster. Questions that need answers before any vote is taken." "Well then, let's hear what you have to say." Martha opened the leather satchel and withdrew the 3 items that had become the foundation of her case: her father's notes, Mrs. Chen's letter, and the original land deed. As she spread them on the table before the council, the room fell silent. These documents show that the Chinese families were granted permanent settlement rights by the railroad company itself, rights that predate any town ordinances and cannot be legally overturned without due process. Councilman Fletcher, who owned the hardware store, leaned forward. "Even if that's true, the ordinance is about improving the appearance of our town. Surely the council has authority to steal legally owned land?" The voice came from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see Sheriff Rawlings stepping forward, because that's what this ordinance amounts to: theft under color of law. Brewster's face reddened. "Sheriff, you're here to keep order, not offer legal opinions. I'm here to uphold the law, and the law says these families have rights." Rawlings walked down the aisle until he stood beside Martha's table. "I've spent the week reviewing the documents Miss Kellerman published. Every claim in that newspaper checks out." Mrs. Morrison stood up. "I'd like to say something." Her voice carried clearly through the room. "Last summer, when the drought killed my kitchen garden, Mrs. Chen gave me enough vegetables to feed my family for 2 weeks, asked nothing in return. That's the kind of neighbor I want in this town. I'll second that." The bank manager rose from his seat. "The Chen family has never missed a payment on their business loan. Their farm stand brings customers to Main Street every Saturday. From a purely economic standpoint, driving them out makes no sense." More voices joined in. A railroad worker testified that the Chinese crew had been the hardest workers on the depot project. A farmer praised the new crops they'd introduced. Even old Pete admitted that Mr. Chen had helped him repair his shop roof during the winter storms. Throughout it all, Mrs. Chen sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. But Martha could see tears sliding down her cheeks as neighbor after neighbor spoke in her family's defense. Finally, Mayor Brewster called for quiet. All right. I think we've heard enough testimony. The question before us is simple. Do we pass Ordinance 47 or not?" "There's another question," Martha said, standing again. "What kind of town do we want to be?" She looked around the room, meeting eyes with people she'd known all her life. "We can be the kind of place that breaks its promises when those promises become inconvenient. We can drive out families who've worked hard and contributed to our community. We can choose fear over justice, prejudice over law. She paused, placing her hand on the deed that proved the Chen family's rights. Or we can be the kind of town that keeps its word. The kind of place where different doesn't mean unwelcome, where the color of your skin doesn't determine the value of your contribution. We can choose to be better than our fears. The courthouse fell silent. Outside, the bell began striking 10:30, each note hanging in the air like a decision waiting to be made. Councilman Fletcher cleared his throat. I move to table Ordinance 47 indefinitely, pending further legal review. Seconded, said another council member quickly. Mayor Brewster looked around the room, reading the faces of his constituents. All in favor? 5 hands rose every council member, except Brewster himself. Motion carries. His voice was grudging but official. Ordinance 47 is tabled indefinitely. The room erupted in applause. Timothy Chen jumped up and hugged his mother, both of them crying and laughing at the same time. Sheriff Rawlings caught Martha's eye and tipped his hat, a gesture of respect that meant more than any words. As the crowd began to disperse, Mrs. Chen approached Martha's table. She took Martha's hands in her own, her eyes bright with tears. "Thank you," she said simply. "You gave us our voice when we could not speak for ourselves." "Your voice was always there," Martha replied. "I just helped it reach the right ears." Outside, the courthouse bell struck 11, and Martha Kellerman packed her father's notes back into the leather satchel. The Millbrook Herald was alive again, and so was the truth it had been created to serve. The sunlight poured through the courthouse windows, warm and golden, and strong enough to chase away even the deepest shadows. Sunday morning brought the kind of crystal-clear sky that made the Colorado mountains look close enough to touch. Martha walked to the newspaper office early. The leather satchel, lighter, now that its burden of proof had been shared with the whole town. The printing press sat uncovered in the morning light, ready for Wednesday's edition. She'd already started working on the next issue, a follow-up story about the council vote, plus a piece about Mrs. Chen's offer to teach interested neighbors how to grow Chinese vegetables. Applications were coming in faster than anyone had expected. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Timothy Chen stood on the threshold, but this time he wasn't alone. His mother waited behind him, holding a small wrapped package. "Miss Kellerman, we brought you something," Timothy said. Mrs. Chen stepped forward and offered the package with a slight bow. Inside, Martha found a delicate silk bookmark embroidered with Chinese characters alongside English words. "Truth and kindness are the best neighbors." "It's beautiful," Martha said. "What do the Chinese characters mean?" "They say the same thing," Mrs. Chen replied, her English careful but confident. "In my country, we believe some truths are so important they must be written in many languages, so no one can claim they didn't understand." Martha placed the bookmark in her father's satchel alongside the papers that had started everything. "Mrs. Chen, would you be interested in writing a regular column for the Herald about gardening, cooking, maybe stories from your homeland? I think our readers would like to learn." Mrs. Chen's face lit up. "You would publish my words every Wednesday, in both languages, if you'd like." As they talked, Martha noticed other changes taking shape outside her window. The depot area looked different now, not because the gardens were gone, but because they were expanding. The Morrison family had asked for permission to plant a plot next to the Chens. The railroad had donated lumber for proper fencing. Even Adelaide Hancock had been seen consulting with Mrs. Chen about something called winter melons. Samuel appeared in the doorway, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing an expression Martha hadn't seen in months, something that might have been pride. "Thought you might need this," he said, setting the cup on her desk. "Mrs. Morrison just ordered 36 copies of Wednesday's edition. Says she wants to send them to her relatives back east, show them what a real community looks like." After the Chens left, Martha and Samuel stood together at the window, watching Main Street come to life. The same buildings, the same mountains in the distance, but somehow everything looked different in the clear morning light. "Papa would be proud," Samuel said quietly. Martha opened the leather satchel one more time and pulled out her father's final notes. On the last page, in his familiar handwriting, she found words she'd never noticed before. "A newspaper doesn't create truth. It simply gives truth a place to stand in the light." She folded the paper carefully and placed it in the satchel, alongside Mrs. Chen's bookmark and the deed that had started everything. 3 props that had carried them all through the darkness and into the light. The The courthouse bell struck 9, calling the town to Sunday services. But here in the newspaper office, Martha Kellerman felt she'd already found her church, a place where truth and kindness lived side by side, where different voices joined together to tell the story of what a community could become when it chose courage over comfort. Outside, sunlight poured down on Millbrook, Colorado, warming the depot gardens where vegetables grew in neat rows, tended by neighbors who were learning that the best harvests come from seeds shared freely and ground prepared with care. The printing press stood ready for Wednesday's edition, and Martha already knew what the headline would be. Growing Together. A community blooms. If something in this story touched you, linger with us. We'll handle the rest.